This is a short story by Ken Bone. It's titled, There Was Silence. There was silence, until I was cursed to hear the all-too-familiar sound of the gate being broken open by several dozen head of horses. Thankfully, I had fallen asleep in my boots and overalls, so I didn't have to worry about throwing them on before I headed out at this unholy hour of the night. Sitting up in bed allowed me to look out the back window, where I woefully confirmed that the gate was indeed wide open. Stepping out the back door of the cabin, my feet hit the porch and irritation hit me across the head as I looked across the meadow at the horses happily stepping out of the gate that stood wide open. There was enough moonlight out to see, but I brought my flashlight and my backup flashlight anyways and just started my minute-long walk to the gate. I got there, fumbled through the tack shed in the dark, and managed to saddle up Old Damnation, and us two set out west, down the meadow, as that's where the hooligans always seem to run off to when they go out on their night walks. To myself, I thought, judging by how many ponies were still in the pen and how many times I've done this before, it should only be a 30-minute deal. I got over the west ridge of the meadow and stopped to survey the land. And sure enough, about 5 head of horses were standing out in the moonlight at the west edge where the grass meets the woods. What I wasn't so sure about was the glow. It seemed to be repressed in the thicket the horses were standing by. It's as if one of those old oil lamps had been lit and set on a stump right at the edge of the tree line. I stopped and puzzled for a second, squinting my eyes to see if there was anything or I was just seeing things. All of my other senses seemed to fade as I focused my attention to the eyesight. Just when the light flickered out and all my other senses came back to me. This was the exact moment a scream of guttural agony cascaded from the darkness at the end of the meadow, just where the light had gone out. For a moment, my entire existence was devoured by the sound, until the sense of touch came back to me as damnation began to tremble and shake below me. Instinctually, I consoled her and got her calmed down. Looking down the meadow, I could see the blur of horses rushing back to the corral as the thundering of hooves rattled through the meadow. It was the second scream that sprung me into action. One of my herd was being harmed in some way or another, and I didn't know by what or how, but I was sure going to find out and put an end to it. I sent Damnation into a full gallop, and my thoughts seemed to race just as fast as she did. Was it a bobcat? A black bear? A coyote? I couldn't see it being any kind of animal. And none of those animals would even mess with a horse. And they were all that was out here predator-wise. I just couldn't fathom what it could be. And then I saw what it had done. I got to the edge of the woods, and right there in the ray of my flashlight lay Apache, his neck glistening crimson. My stomach turned, and Damnation snorted and whinnied as we heard him gurgling there, choking on his own blood. Something had cut all around his neck in 3 places. I scanned the flashlight through the trees and couldn't see any sign of life or footprints or anything. Oddly, the scent of kerosene stained the air in such an encompassing manner, and I'm not sure why, but at that moment, I turned the flashlight off. The glow was to the southwest, a ways away in the darkness of the woods, but it was without a doubt the same glow that was at the edge of the woods where Apache now lies. I sent Damnation into a trot in its direction and turned my flashlight back on when the light vanished. Realizing I wouldn't be able to track down a dim glow when I had a 2,000 lumen bulb shining through the woods, I slowed down and navigated with the light of the moon. We had been moving along for 30 seconds, gaining on this orange speck in the distance, when I decided to flash my light for a second to get my bearings. God, I wish I would have just continued in the dark. And the beam of the flashlight, dead ahead, was a doe, nearly decapitated and malignantly bloated. No signs of any missing flesh. The animal was simply slaughtered and left as is. I press on, and with every clicking of my light, with every foot I come closer to the glow, there was more carrion, killed and cut at the throat, and left there. There was even dead buzzards next to some of the bodies, having been beheaded. The smell of kerosene grew stronger and more pungent and finally the glow was 20 paces ahead. I brought damnation to a stop and stared at that flickering light. It had to be some kind of lunatic killing animals for sport in the most sadistic way possible. I sat for a moment, looking at the light to make sure it was really there. And by the way damnation snorted, I knew she could see it too. The moon allowed for barely any visibility in these woods. There was silence. I broke it and shouted, "You don't know it, but you just landed yourself in a whole world of trouble when you killed my horse, and I have the law on the way right now." Which was a lie. There wasn't a town with a police officer for 100 miles in each direction. I continued, "And if you try anything again, me and my gun will be glad to take matters into our own hands." God, how I wished I had fallen asleep with my pistol on my hip. There was silence. It was broken by the click of my flashlight, and at that very instant, the glow disappeared, and two impossibly large eyes shined in the dark. They were the size of dinner plates and stood about 11 foot off the ground, much closer than 20 paces from me. Damnation lost all composure and began bucking. I was ejected from the saddle and thrown on the ground as damnation took off somewhere in the darkness. I'd lost my flashlight and my bearings. Any sense of direction was gone. I was thrust into sheer panic. I began to run in a random direction. I could think no thoughts but terror. I felt no emotion but fear. I could sense nothing but horror as I tore through the woods. I had lost all sight of the glow, but was still running. I was passing through some brambles when I tripped on something and fell face first into something wet. I reached for my extra flashlight, and with one click, it revealed the corpse of several headless coyotes, with some being mutilated to the point of being near unrecognizable. There was a putrefied blood now splattered all over me. I turned the flashlight off to reveal myself of the sight. Just as the 2,000 lumens vanished, the dim orange glow appeared, 50 paces to the left, and the scent of kerosene rose in my nostrils. I clicked the flashlight in its direction, and two massive eyes shined bright as headlights about 13 foot in the air, 20 paces away. I can't even tell you what happened in the following moments. It seemed like if I were to run at less than 150% of my all, it meant certain doom. Every breath was drenched with the stench of rancid blood that stained my clothes. It felt as if my neck grew tighter and tighter as I could barely grasp for air to continue running. I collapsed and looked up. I was 5 paces from the meadow. With all that I had left in me, I carried my corpse of a body to the grass and lay there. As I caught a glimpse of the moon through the clouds above, there was silence. My pounding heart commanded my body to trudge back to the cabin, and I obeyed its commands. I opened the front door and slammed it shut, and went to the nightstand and pulled out my Remington 1858, stepped out onto the back porch. I looked across the meadow to see not a single horse in sight. I was alone. There was silence. The moon glistened on the barrel of the gun. I stood there on the porch, just leaning with my back against the door, and the meadow out in front of me. I tried not to think. Damnation, Apache, the doe, the buzzards, those coyotes, the glow, those eyes. The silence was deafening. I was so lost in my thoughts. All I could do was stand with my hand on that trigger, ready for anything at all. I frantically scanned the meadow for anything, for what seemed like ages. I stood, just waiting for my fate to arrive. I was ever so frantically motionless when I could not be any more prepared. Kerosene. 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 The odor crept down my nose and stole away, toiling in my lungs. My eyes darted from left to right, my heart pumping with awful anticipation, when I noticed my peripheral vision. There was a soft glow on the railing of the porch. All of the thoughts stopped at once. All of the senses stood at a standstill. My eyes were instantly stupefied at the shade of light across the railing. All of my being was consumed by this ever so faint orange hue that took to the flimsy planks that stood before me. The petrified hysteria truly engulfed me when I saw the shadow of the window pane being cast in the light. Intrusively, my head creaked to the right, and my eyes darted to the back window. Through the window pane, ever so slightly, was the reflection of two massive saucer-like eyes shining through the window pane in the reflection of the moonlight, like two massive pools of pearlescent myrrh. There was no time. There was no breath. There was no blood. There were no horses. There was no gun. There was no moon. There was no meadow. There was no woods. There was no silence. There were two eyes and fear. I remained motionless as the orange light grew. It began to glow all over the walls of the cabin, the trees, the rifle of the gun, and the center of the eyes. Looking through the glass of the eyes, my eyes switched focus as the reflection of the orange sun broke over the tree line to the east, and its stinging rays scorched my eyes in the reflection of the window pane. I refocused my eyes through the glass into the cabin, and the eyes were gone. As the sun illuminated all in the meadow, I could feel the warmth of the sun on my back, and the sound of the horses trotting could be heard in the distance, as well as my knees hitting the floor of the porch, and a long exhale of relief from my mouth.